Okay, first, the Netflix CEO said he thinks Barbie and Oppenheimer would have still been big events if they premiered on Netflix. Then Hollywood had its worst Memorial Day box office in decades, and it's bringing up an old anxiety. How worried should we be about the future of movie theaters? I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. I mean, look, the May long weekend typically is supposed to be the big long weekend that kicks off the summer blockbuster season. But this year, it was the slowest it has been in over 40 years. That's pretty remarkable. Now, you could come up with a whole bunch of reasons for why people are just not going to the theaters, but one large possibility is that life just is not going to go back to the thing that it was before the pandemic, and also before we all got used to streaming movies at home. That this theory would have to sort of account for the fact that Barbie and Oppenheimer were in fact a blip, and that the model has actually changed for good. And as I said, that's just a possibility. I don't know if that's the actual answer, but this morning we're going to try to get to that answer with Bilge Ebiri and Kristy Puchko. Bilge, Kristy, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Welcome back. Listen, people are stressed out. People are stressed out about the box office. Is the box office in crisis? That's truly the question we're going to try to answer here. But maybe, Bill, I'll start with this question. How important is an opening weekend these days as just an indicator of a film's actual success?
I think opening weekends are still really important, not because they need to be important, but because Hollywood has basically created this entire system where everything is building up to opening weekend, right? They make these huge movies, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars marketing them, and it's all geared towards trying to get a big, huge opening weekend. Other movies move out of the way, and then, they open in 4,000 theaters, they do all the marketing, they do all the interviews, blah, 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 and then the movie opens, and if either it opens big or it underperforms or it totally flops, and then they don't really have anything else to do after that. They just sit around and wait for it to decline and slowly fade. The marketing drops out of the picture. Yeah. Another big movie opens up the next weekend, and it's quickly forgotten. I actually believe that Hollywood can do things differently, but for the past, 15, 20 years and even longer, the supremacy of the opening weekend has been unmatched.
Yeah, there's been sort of like a really intense focus of saying, well, this is where all the energy is going. Where else would you put the energy except for like this one weekend? And then there's a pressure on the opening weekend to sort of recoup most of the costs of a movie. Like that's become like the measure of success of an opening weekend, which I would say. Kristy, why don't you think the opening weekend is as big a draw as it once was?
I mean, I think that Hollywood has steadily been undercutting the event of an opening weekend. I think part of it is definitely unavoidable with COVID. A lot of things went straight to streaming, and I think they had to. But now we're out of that, and the window between when things are going to theaters and going to streaming is practically non-existent. I mean, The Fall Guy is already on VOD. The Fall Guy had a bad opening weekend. Yeah. You can already rent it.
A movie that came out 3.5 weeks ago is already on video on demand.
Right. And so it's just like there's no incentive for an audience, especially a casual moviegoer, to like see it in theaters. Because I mean, we're seeing that with Furiosa, right? Like this was supposed to be the big movie. Everybody loved Fury Road. Everyone and their grandmother and their grandmother's uncle loved that movie. Why didn't this one do well? And I think there's a couple of things contributing to that. It is a prequel, and it is a prequel that brings back none of the original actors, which in my mind is deranged. But like on top of that, if people were watching Fury Road on their TV and going, man, this movie still rules, that doesn't necessarily indicate to them they have to see the new one in the theater. Yeah. Where Fury Road, we were telling people, you've never seen anything like this before. And with this one, we're like, it's just like Fury Road.
I mean, I also have to say, like, for all the noise that we've been making about Fury Road, which is the last Mad Max movie before Furiosa, Bilge, like, Fury Road did not have the opening weekend that, that people are sort of romanticizing of, like, Days of Yore. Like, I think he made, like, $45 million on his opening weekend. Like, pretty respectable showing. But, like, the idea that Furiosa comes in around $30 million, I don't look at that and go, like, oh, that's a collapse in the system. I go, that kind of makes sense to me. That's not really surprising,
Yeah, and that's also part of the problem with the whole opening weekend thing is that each new movie, especially if others have underperformed, each new movie becomes the potential savior of the film industry. And it's like, guys, it's Furiosa, it's a crazy George Miller post-apocalyptic, what's it, like, and
And a
Fury Road
spin-off
was
series at that, you
right,
know what I mean? Yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
Fury Road was a success, but it wasn't like a gargantuan success. I mean, it opened at number 2 behind, I believe, Pitch Perfect 2. Like, it was not. I mean, at least Furiosa beat Garfield barely, but it made like 148 million, 145 million dollars, or something like that. But it did better overseas, and obviously it was an epical critical success. It won Oscars. It was nominated for a whole bunch, including Best Picture. So in our minds, it's obviously this huge movie. I think the Warner people knew that Furiosa wasn't going to be like a billion-dollar blockbuster. I think part of the problem is also, we are experiencing a bit of a dearth of quote unquote product because of sort of the there was COVID, there was the production backlog because of COVID, and then there were the strikes. So there are actually fewer movies, and some movies have moved out of the way. We talked about The Fall Guy. The Fall Guy was supposed to open in March, right? It moved into May when Deadpool versus Wolverine moved out of the slot.
Yeah.
And, I am a big Fall Guy fan. I would like to point out to you that movie has had very small drops after its disappointing opening weekend.
Continued,
and if they,
right.
And if they
had
maybe kept it in theaters for a little longer, I think that movie would actually make its money back. But again, Hollywood doesn't think that way anymore.
I'm glad that you brought up the thing with The Fall Guy, because it was supposed to be. It is a March movie. It is not. I don't look at that movie and go, this is a movie that resurrects all of blockbusters. This is a movie that sort of feels of a piece with like movies we used to get in the slower seasons leading up to the summer blockbuster season. But also, I want to go back to the fact that like it's May. We've had a couple of pretty significant blockbuster hits already, Kristy. And one of them, I don't like that it was a hit, but it was a hit. But like Godzilla X Kong was a massive movie. That movie opened, it had like, I think it had like the 5th biggest Easter, opening weekends of all time. It's just that like these are not the movies that we pin our hopes on. And Dune 2 did, massive numbers as well. And so there's this thing where we sort of romanticize certain movies and certain slots and go, well, this is the Memorial Day opening weekend. He must perform these massive numbers. When in fact, a silly Godzilla versus Kong sequel, I should say, The New Empire, it was the second movie in the series, and it still did pretty huge numbers.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a question of what's going to get people excited to go like, why do I need to see this in a theater? And I think part of that is spectacle, which Furiosa has, but also part of it is audience and community. And like, people love a Godzilla movie, like even if it's nonsense. So like, and also I feel like I truly do think that the Japanese Godzilla movie, Godzilla -1, that got people super excited again about that property ahead of this one, helped
100%.
this American movie in ways that like have not been properly recognized. But also just like, what is a movie that makes you say with your friends, like, hey, let's go see this, and like, hey, let's go see this opening night. And like, it used to be for a while, for a very long time, it was the superhero movies, right? Because you wanted to see them, not just opening weekend, opening night, man. Take me to a midnight screening. I don't want any spoilers. I don't want Twitter ruining it. Like, there was a sense of urgency. And that sense of urgency doesn't really exist anymore. So what they need to, because they're trying with the opening weekend, they're like, everyone needs to see it opening weekend, blah, 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 blah. But they need to create a sense of community. And I think where Fall Guy really failed is that movie was marketing to Barbie fans when
because of Ryan Gosling.
Yeah, they're like, oh, you like Ryan Gosling? Other Ryan Gosling movie. It's like, yeah, sure, go see Drive too while you're at it. Like, that's not
very
a good
different movies. They're not.
Not a good connective tissue.
Yeah,
and like, I think that The Fall Guy, had it actually marketed to people who, one, remembered the TV show, or two, even remembered like the heyday of action comedies that it is alluding to, like Romancing the Stone. It would have done better. Because what's hilarious is, like, my parents were like, what is this movie, The Fall Guy? And I said, it's based on that TV show. And they were like, oh, and then they were interested. Then they found out they could rent it and they weren't going to go see it in theaters anymore. But one, they had no idea that was the connection. And my mom's literal response, I love her, my boomer mother's response was, oh, I thought that was for kids. Because they were selling it to to a young Barbie crowd. So they completely shot themselves in the foot by trying to be like, we're young and hip. Don't pay attention that it's a remake. Which is like, it is what it is. Lean into it. It was a showbiz comedy. It was an action comedy. It had a lot going for it, but that's not what they were selling it as.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Bilge.
Well, I was going to say, the other day, I actually had an Uber driver, an older gentleman, and we got to talking about movies, and he was talking about how he likes going to the movie theaters and likes to see the big new releases. And he said, "What should I see?" And I said, "Oh, you should see The Fall Guy. It's really good." And he said, "The Fall Guy, is that based on the TV show?" And he was like, "That was my favorite TV show when I was younger." He's like, "Who's in it?" I said, "Ryan Gosling." He's like, "I love Ryan Gosling."
Those people never heard. To Kristy's point, those people never got the message.
We as a society failed that man, right? We as a society failed that man. He's an action movie fan.
Yeah.
He loves Ryan Gosling. Ryan Gosling is starring in a remake of his favorite TV show from when he was younger. And somehow we did not figure out a way to let this man know that The Fall Guy was in theaters.
But to Kristy's larger point, though, like, if you're the Fall Guy, if you're in charge of marketing The Fall Guy, you're thinking Ryan Gosling is just coming off this really hot year for Barbie, and so I'm going to use that communication method. I'm going to use those channels we've already established in order to connect to those people, because they're actually willing to go to the theater. I kind of want to zoom out for a moment, because I do think like Barbie and Oppenheimer do cast a large shadow over this whole conversation, Bilge. Because like people, like even though everyone went to Barbie and Oppenheimer and it was this big box office phenomenon, people still spent $2 billion less going to the movies than they did before the pandemic last year. Do you think we'll go back to see movies in theaters the way that we used to?
I don't know if we'll go back to seeing them the way that we used to, say, 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we need to, right?
Okay.
Because I think Hollywood can be more sustainable if it's making more films that aren't necessarily huge films that need to make $1 billion to break even, right? I mean, if you remember, last year was a terrible box office year until Barbie and Oppenheimer came along and kind of saved everybody's skin. And up until that point, we were doing the things we're doing now, which is writing all the think pieces about what's wrong with the summer. And then, these two movies, everything's fixed, never mind, everybody go back home. But no, it's, those films were a phenomenon. Every once in a while you will have phenomenon, but, an industry that is increasingly reliant on out of the box successes like that is can't survive in the way that it thinks it's going to survive.
I mean, Kristy, I think like a crude way to look at the movies that are being greenlit is to look at them and say, studios are looking at a movie and saying, if I put $200 million in, I can get $600 million out. It's like sort of like a little slot machine that triples your money sort of instantly. That's kind of the model that has been the model for maybe like the last 6 years or so. And yes, of course, the cost of going to the movies is a huge factor right now. But like putting that aside, how much do you think the lack of people going to the movie theaters has to do with just the type of movies that are being greenlit at the moment?
I mean, I think that's a huge part of it. I feel like because they are continually trying to make movies that are for everyone and then fail to be for everyone. That's the part that's getting lost in the equation. They're trying to make these enormous movies and then acting like they're for everybody, and they're not. And I think that's why we're seeing much more interesting films doing well on smaller levels. Like there were some really weird films that came out earlier this year that did really well because they were smaller. Like A24 is great at this, right? That they'll make a small, weird little movie and then they know how to pepper it. They're like, let's get people out there. Let's get Kristen Stewart talking about the female gaze. Like,
yes.
That makes things feel special and exciting instead of acting like this movie is for everyone. And I feel like that's the thing. Nobody wants to like concentrate on the niches, right? But like back when we had mid-budget and small budget movies, you could just have like a weird, and like sometimes they would blow up. Like sometimes, I mean, like I feel like wasn't like Beetlejuice was like a mid-budget movie, wasn't it, Bilge? Am I remembering this? Yeah. And like it is a cultural phenomenon now.
Yeah.
And like, that's the thing. It's like with these weirder little movies, filmmakers were able to take risks, and like you see some of that on Netflix because like people can make weirder movies, but also there's a certain pressure to fit within an algorithm on Netflix. So like I wish more things were doing like A24, which is making really wild movies, and sometimes they work, and if they don't work, you're just never going to hear about that movie again.
And that's fine, and that's totally fine.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's like these studios they make so much stuff and so much big stuff that it's like the studios have actually lost any kind of sense of authorship. Where like you used to know what a Warner Brothers movie was going to look like, a Universal movie was going to look like. They had a sensibility to them that dates back to like literally when they had actors on contract.
Yeah.
But like anymore, it's so depleted that like, I have to check my email 15 times to be like, which PR rep am I emailing? Because it's not distinctive anymore.
That's it's the way that you said it sounded really grim. It sounded really grim because he makes movies a little bit less valuable, Bilge. Like we sort of talk about them as less as pieces of art that people are pouring their heart into, and more as like cultural products that have to hit 4-quadrant marketing in order to actually like succeed. And that's grim and cynical, but is there another way to look at it aside from that, do you think?
Well, I think we have to step away from this idea, and I agree. We currently are kind of stuck in this like very, very poisonous binary of the movies are either enormous, giant, out on 4,000 screens, have to have a huge opening weekend.
Yeah.
Or they're tiny, disposable, and they're on Netflix or whatever, and you can kind of ignore them, or you can watch them while you're on Twitter or doing the laundry or whatever.
Second screen experiences, as they say.
The second screen experience. And that's terrible because those smaller movies are the ones that actually kind of need your attention, right? I mean, those are the movies that you sort of are supposed to pay attention to because they're interesting dramas or comedies or things like that. And those films actually would benefit even more from being in theaters, and being seen in theaters. Unfortunately, because of the way, the industry is currently structured, people very often don't go out to see those movies because there's this anticipation that, it'll just be on, they always say, it'll be on Netflix in a few weeks. Even if it's not going to actually be on Netflix ever because it's, a Fox release.
Yeah.
But it's become kind of this shorthand. And that's unfortunate because then those films don't get the kind of love that they need to, and they don't get the kind of attention that they need to. I was very impressed with how A24 released Civil War. I was very impressed with the release of Challengers. I mean, these are films.
Yes.
These could be, properly released studio films and things like that. I mean, and they're still in theaters actually doing okay, even though they're also on digital. So I think we need more movies like that. And I think the studios need to make more movies like that. They can still make the big movies, but if you make more sort of mid-budget movies, then the big movies don't have to save your company every single time they open.
Yeah, there's so much pressure on those large movies to just do basically everything for the company. Look, if folks are just joining us, my name is Alamin Abdulmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. I'm here with movie critics Bilge Ebiri and Kristy Puchko, and we're talking about this summer box office slump, which feels a little early to be talking about a summer box office slump, but yet here we are. This has kind of become the new reality. Look, we've been talking, you sort of mentioned the idea that, people say, it's just going to be on Netflix in a little while, so why don't I just wait for that? Netflix is kind of become this omnipresent force in the way that we think about when we will see movies, because they've trained, not just Netflix, but streaming networks in general have trained us to go like, maybe this will be available for me really soon. And then I don't have to go out there and watch in a theater. I want you guys to take a listen to this moment from Lula Garcia Navarro's conversation with the head of Netflix, Ted Sarandos.
I guess I'm thinking of a Barbie, an Oppenheimer. I mean, are there things that just don't feel like they're in your wheelhouse right now?
I think both of those movies would be great for Netflix. They definitely would have enjoyed just as big an audience on Netflix, and so I don't think there's any reason to believe that certain kind of movies do or don't work. There's no reason to believe that the size of the screen or that the movie itself for all people is better in any size of screen. My son's an editor. He's 28 years old. And he watched Lawrence of Arabia on his phone. I can't,
Oh, no.
I don't understand that.
Oh, that's sacrilege.
Okay, so I just want to tell people listening on podcasts and radio that Bilge and Kristy are looking distressed, positively distressed, as they were listening to Ted Sarandos' words there. Bilge, what's your reaction? Put your face into words for me, if you will.
This man. This man will be the death of me. This man will be the death of me. I mean, where to start? That whole interview is just, there's so many things to talk about there. But even in that little quote, first of all, no, Barbie and Oppenheimer would not have been as successful on Netflix. People were dressing up as Barbie. They were dressing up as J. Robert Oppenheimer.
There were Barbenheimer raves. It's like, that was like, not to interrupt, but it's like, yeah, exactly that. Because it's like, don't get me wrong, people get excited about Netflix stuff. You're seeing a lot of excitement online about Bridgerton. And there are some Netflix hosted Bridgerton events. But Barbie didn't have to do that. People were making up their own events. That is such used car salesman bullshit talk. I can't. And I'm glad you included the bit where he says that his editor's son watched Lawrence of Arabia on
his
phone
phone.
because fire him.
The man's poor child catching strays. I feel so bad for him.
Continue your point, Bilge, because there's a lot to talk about here in just a 40-second clip. Yeah.
And there is a lot of this kind of, I mean, I tweeted about this because I think this is just a very bad faith thing for him to say. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The problem isn't that you can't watch Lawrence of Arabia on a small screen. You can't. It's not going to be as great. I first saw it on VHS cropped, the video looked terrible. I thought it was a great movie. I couldn't wait to see it on a theater screen.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, in a world without movie theaters or thriving movie theaters, nobody will make Lawrence of Arabia. In fact, I mean, Lawrence of Arabia dates from that period when Hollywood was desperately trying to make bigger and bigger, big widescreen movies to compete with television. I mean, this is a period in Hollywood, in film industry history in the 50s and 60s when they're competing with television, and they develop things like widescreen and 70 millimeter and all this stuff in an effort to try and compete and differentiate themselves from just ordinary stuff on television. So in the world that Ted Sarandos wants to exist, which is frankly a one without movie theaters, nobody's going to make Lawrence of Arabia. They might make Bridgerton, which is great, but that's not a movie and it's not Lawrence of Arabia. And for him to bring that example, I mean, I feel bad for his son. His son can watch.
No,
movie.
Boo. I shame that. I don't feel bad for anybody there.
Sarandos Jr. innocent, but Sarandos Sr. straight to The Hague.
Kristy, I'm interested in this because it got such a big reaction from literally everybody who saw it. But the best defense I can think of Ted Sarandos, the most generous interpretation of that, is he's saying if people enjoy the content, then that should be the defining feature of how people do. And one of the references that he makes, you're just getting stressed out, getting ready to answer this. I love that. Yeah. I love that. But one of the points that he's making here is and he literally used the Lindsay Lohan movie as the Irish Wish as the example of well, people love that, so what do you want from me? So he's kind of defining enjoyment as a criteria. Where does that fall short for you?
Well, first of all, to quote the great TikTok filmmaker Francesca Scorsese, 70 millimeter hits different.
Yes.
There are different screen sizes that work well for different things. And I understand if you're bored and you just want something to zone out to on your phone, watch whatever you want. I don't care. But don't tell people that if you watch Lawrence of Arabia on your phone, you keep that to yourself. That's embarrassing. Keep this. But beyond that, his definition of enjoying Irish Wish, for the record, is that people watched it the whole way through. That's what he says in that interview. Yeah. And let me explain something to you. One, Netflix doesn't know if you're still watching it. They just know that it's playing. So if I turn that movie on and I'm doing laundry and then go leave and do something else, it doesn't know. If I fall asleep, it doesn't know. And also, finishing a movie doesn't mean that you enjoyed it. It doesn't mean you're going to watch it again. It's such a deranged thing because we know this. The Netflix algorithm counts how many minutes you watch something. Mm-hmm. It doesn't know how many people watched it. So that's where we go back to it being insane that he says that Barbie would have done just as well. We would have no idea how many people saw Barbie if it went to Netflix. And because Netflix is real squiffy on their numbers, we would truly never know. And they're going back to that in 2025. So continue to be mystified by all their decisions. But the idea that, because he also says in that interview, I forget what the first thing is. He's like, well, it's not Bridgerton. Oh, he's like, I like the Queen's Gambit, but is it cake? And it's like, stop. You can say we all contain multitudes. I like some crappy TV shows too. That's totally fine. That doesn't make them good. That doesn't make them quality. And his argument is if there's an audience for it, then it's good. Absolutely not. We have established, look at American junk food. Truly, we will eat garbage because it's cheap and it's there. That doesn't make any of it good. And that's the thing. It's Netflix is his counter argument, right, is that they've had Best Picture nominees. And it's because then they can say, look at what we're capable of. It doesn't mean that they're striving for that regularly. I mean, good God, there are so many Netflix movies lately that just, I can't. I got 4 minutes into Thelma and the Unicorn and decided that just literally you couldn't pay me to finish that movie.
This is a wonderful place to leave it because we're leaving it at the very height of Mount frustration at the ways that Netflix
Thelma the Unicorn catching strays.
Yeah. Why not? Everybody's catching strays today. But also, Kristy and Bilge, I gotta leave it there. But I appreciate your time and I appreciate your thoughts about the crisis in box office, which turns out to be the crisis in all of us. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
My name is Elamine. This show is called Commotion. I think we could yell about this for another 2 days, but we got to leave it there. So you have yourself a great day. See you tomorrow.